You did something unholy, huh? Funny thing about that word, unholy. People throw it around like they're saints, like they've never done anything in the dark. But everyone's got a little stain on their soul, something they hide, something they whisper to themselves when the lights go out. You see, what they call unholy isn't always evil. Sometimes it's just real. Sometimes it's the part of you that refused to stay silent. The part that broke the rules to survive. They'll call it sin because it doesn't fit their story. Because it scares them to see you do what they secretly wish they could. But you know what's worse than doing something unholy? Pretending you're pure when you're not. Every sin starts with truth people couldn't handle. That's how it always begins. Not with evil, but with honesty. Someone saw something, felt something, knew something too real for everyone else to stomach. And instead of facing it, they called it sin. They labeled it wrong because it didn't fit inside their fragile little rules. People don't actually hate sin. They hate the mirror it holds up. They hate the reflection that reminds them how thin the line really is between right and real. You ever notice how the most condemned acts are usually born from the same desires everyone hides? The difference is, some people act on them and others just bury them deep. But the truth doesn't die just because you hide it. It rots, it festers, it grows teeth, and when it finally comes out, the world points and says, unholy. But the truth was never unholy. It was just too raw, too honest, too alive for their comfort. Every sin starts with something pure, a need, a dream, a hunger. But purity scares people. They dress it up, chain it down, call it by safer names so they don't have to face what it really is. Desire becomes shame, anger becomes sin, passion becomes taboo. The world teaches you to hide your fire, and when you finally burn anyway, they scream that you've done something wicked. But what did you really do? You told the truth with your actions. You showed them what they're too afraid to admit about themselves. The truth has always been dangerous. It doesn't blend well with control. So they built systems, religions, codes, all to keep it contained. They tell you what's right, what's wrong, what's holy, what's damned. They turn truth into obedience and call it morality. But morality is just a leash made of fear. It's not about good or bad. It's about keeping you predictable. And when someone steps outside that pattern, even for a second, they become a threat. Not because they sinned, but because they revealed how fragile the whole system really is. Sin is what happens when truth refuses to stay buried. When the things you've been taught to suppress finally claw their way out. It's the soul's rebellion against the lie of perfection. You can't cage human nature and expect it not to bite back. Everyone has a breaking point, a moment where silence feels heavier than guilt. And when that moment comes, people do what they must. They choose survival over reputation, freedom over forgiveness. Then the world points and calls it unholy. Just so it doesn't have to admit it, it would have done the same. The word, sin, is a story told by the fearful to control the fearless. It's a label for anything that doesn't fit their comfort zone. You tell the truth too loud. They call it disrespect. You fight back. They call it pride. You follow your heart. They call it rebellion. But the world forgets that every act of creation, every spark of change, every revolution started with someone doing something unholy. They broke a rule, crossed a line, shattered an illusion. That's how progress is born, from the cracks in the old moral walls. The first time you do something they call unholy, it burns. You feel the guilt, the shame, the fear of being seen. But then something strange happens. Underneath the noise, you feel alive. You feel real. Because sin isn't just about breaking the rules. It's about remembering you're human. It's about feeling something raw, something unfiltered, something that reminds you you're not just a cog in their machine. You can't find freedom without first being called wrong by someone who never understood you. The ones who throw stones the loudest are always the ones with the dirtiest hands. They use your sin to hide their own. It's easier to condemn than to confess. So they build walls of judgment to protect themselves from reflection. They call themselves righteous because it keeps them from looking in the mirror. But they know, deep down, they know. They envy the courage it takes to do something unholy, to act on a truth they only dare to dream about. People fear truth because it exposes them. It strips away the polite masks, the good manners, the false halos. It shows them what they really are: imperfect, hungry, human. That's why they'd rather call the truth sinful. Because if it's sin, they don't have to face it. They can stay safe inside their illusion of holiness, pretending their cages are made of virtue. But those cages always crack. And when they do, the truth seeps out. Ugly, messy, unstoppable. Every sin starts with truth people couldn't handle. Someone saw through the lie. Someone felt something real, and the world couldn't take it. So they called it sin to make themselves feel better. But the truth doesn't care what name you give it. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't apologize for being real. It just stands there, unholy and undeniable, reminding everyone that holiness was never about purity. It was about control. And control only works until the truth decides to speak. Guilt is just society's way of keeping you obedient. It's not born inside you. It's planted. A seed buried deep in your mind when you were too young to question it. Every time you think for yourself, every time you step out of line, that seed grows a little thorn. You feel it twisting in your chest, whispering, "You shouldn't." That's guilt. A voice that doesn't belong to you, but one you've learned to obey. It's the invisible chain that keeps everyone in place, pretending, performing, apologizing for being human. They teach you guilt early, like a trick. You do something natural. Feel angry, want more. Speak up, and someone tells you it's wrong. They frown, they scold, they make you feel small. And you learn fast. Being yourself comes with punishment. So you start trimming pieces of who you are just to fit into their box. They call it discipline, but it's training. They're not raising thinkers. They're building followers. People who feel guilty for wanting anything that doesn't serve the system. Guilt isn't justice. It's control. It keeps you crawling back to the rules even after they've failed you. You could burn, starve, bleed, and still feel guilty for asking. Why? That's how deep it goes. They make you believe that pain is virtue, that suffering is holy, that wanting peace is selfish. So you keep quiet. You play along. You let the guilt weigh you down like a leash, because you're too afraid to know who you'd be without it. The strange part is, guilt doesn't stop bad people from doing wrong. It only stops good people from being free. The cruel, the powerful, they don't feel guilt. They call it strategy, necessity, survival. But the honest ones, the ones who still feel something, they're the ones guilt eats alive. It convinces them to apologize for existing, for speaking, for feeling too much. It turns good hearts into prisoners, always seeking forgiveness for sins they never actually committed. Guilt has a taste. Bitter, metallic, heavy. It sits on your tongue after you tell the truth. It burns in your stomach after you say, no. It whispers that you've disappointed someone, that you've broken a rule, that you should have stayed quiet. And because the world worships obedience, you believe it. You think guilt means you've done something wrong. But sometimes guilt means you're finally doing something right. Sometimes it's not a warning. It's a sign you're waking up. You ever wonder why people in power love talking about guilt? It keeps everyone else small. A guilty person is easy to control. They don't fight back. They don't question. They spend their lives trying to make up for something that wasn't even their fault. They carry invisible weight, apologizing for things like existing, dreaming, failing. Guilt turns people into puppets who think they're sinners when they're just human. It's the perfect weapon. No force, no violence, just shame. The thing about guilt is, it doesn't come from what you did. It comes from who you disappointed. Every time you break a rule, you don't feel bad because the rule was right. You feel bad because someone taught you to. They gave you that feeling like a hand-me-down curse. You carry it without asking why. And before long, it becomes instinct. You start punishing yourself before anyone else has to. You become your own jailer, your own judge. That's how they win. They don't need to lock you up. They just teach you to hate the sound of your own freedom. People think guilt is morality, but it's not. It's fear of judgment disguised as conscience. It's the ghost of every rule you never agreed to, haunting you every time you try to live differently. They tell you guilt makes you good, but it doesn't. It makes you manageable. A guilty mind is easier to steer. It bends, apologizes, hesitates. It does what it's told, not because it believes, but because it's afraid of being labeled wrong. Real freedom starts where guilt ends. When you realize that guilt isn't your voice, that it doesn't come from your soul, but from the world's expectations, something inside you breaks loose. You start to see how much of your life was built around pleasing people who were never watching. How much of your silence was obedience dressed as decency. Guilt keeps you small because it convinces you you're dangerous when you start thinking for yourself. But you're not dangerous. You're awake. They want you to believe guilt makes you human. But humanity isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. It's about choice. You can't feel true compassion while drowning in guilt. Because guilt isn't empathy. It's fear. It's self. Punishment dressed as virtue. They've turned it into a tool to make you doubt your own instincts. Every time you say no, they call it heartless. Every time you stand up, they call it arrogant. Every time you choose yourself, they call it selfish. And you feel guilty, even though you were just being honest. That's the game. Guilt is the leash you never notice until it's pulled. It tugs when you start to rise, when you step out of their line, when you remember you have your own voice. You feel it pulling you back, whispering, "Don't go too far." But far is exactly where the truth begins. Guilt keeps you soft, keeps you sorry, keeps you from realizing that maybe you weren't wrong at all. Maybe you were just the only one brave enough to act without their permission. The unholy are simply the honest ones caught in the act. That's the secret no one likes to admit. The ones branded as sinners, monsters, outcasts. They're just the ones who stopped pretending. They did what everyone else dreams of, but doesn't dare to do. They spoke what others whisper. They acted on truths others bury. And the world can't stand that. Because when someone dares to live without disguise, it exposes how fake everyone else is. Society doesn't hate sin. It hates exposure. It hates the reminder that beneath all the smiles and sermons, everyone's got a little dirt on their hands. You ever notice how people love to point fingers? The louder they scream, "Unholy," the more they're hiding. It's projection in its purest form. They attack what they see in themselves. The one who shames desire is the one consumed by it. The one preaching purity is the one drowning in guilt. They can't face their reflection, so they break the mirror. They call others corrupt, just to distract from the cracks in their own halo. That's how it works. The so-called righteous need sinners to stay relevant. Without someone to condemn, their holiness means nothing. Being unholy isn't about evil. It's about honesty. It's what happens when you stop filtering your humanity to make it palatable. When you stop apologizing for feeling too much, wanting too deeply, thinking too freely. They call that rebellion. But it's not rebellion. It's nature. The real rebellion is living truthfully in a world built on lies. And those who do, they pay the price. They get labeled, judged, exiled. But deep down, everyone envies them. Because while the holy ones live in cages of rules and appearances, the unholy ones breathe. People crave freedom but fear what it looks like. They think they want liberation until they meet someone who actually lives it. Then they call it madness. Because freedom without guilt, without shame, without masks, it's too raw. It reminds them how much of their life is performance. They pretend to be good because they're terrified of being seen as real. They think goodness is about image, about reputation. But the ones they call unholy, they already lost that game. They stopped caring what the world thinks. That's why they're dangerous. You can't control someone who's not afraid to be seen. Every saint has a sinner's story. Every sinner has a saint's reason. The difference is only exposure. Who got caught? Who didn't? The world doesn't judge by truth. It judges by timing. Do the wrong thing at the right moment, and you're bold. Do the right thing at the wrong moment, and you're damned. The unholy ones are simply those whose truths came out when the world wasn't ready to hear them. History turns them into villains, then later, legends. That's the cycle. Today's unholy is tomorrow's misunderstood visionary. What's funny is that the unholy never pretend to be perfect. They already know what they are. They've seen their shadows, touched their hunger, made peace with their flaws. They don't wear masks because they've already faced what's behind them. It's the holy ones you need to worry about. The ones desperate to look pure, to sound righteous, to be adored. They're the ones hiding monsters behind smiles. The unholy don't need to hide. They've already been exposed. And there's a strange kind of peace in that. When the world has already seen your worst, you're free to be honest. The world runs on hypocrisy. They tell you to be good but reward deceit. They preach truth but celebrate performance. They say, be yourself, but only if that self fits their comfort zone. So when someone refuses to shrink, refuses to fake it, they become a problem. The unholy aren't criminals. They're reminders. They remind the world of everything it's buried, the hunger, the chaos, the contradiction. They live in the open what everyone else hides in secret. That's why they're hated. Not because they're wrong, but because they're proof. The unholy walk through life with a certain stillness. They've stopped begging for forgiveness from people who never meant to forgive them. They've stopped trying to explain their reasons to ears that only want judgment. There's a strange freedom in being condemned. It means you're done performing. You stop living for their approval and start living for your own truth. That's when you become untouchable. Because what can they take from someone who's already been stripped of everything fake? Everyone wants to be holy until it costs them their comfort. Everyone wants truth until it demands exposure. But the unholy, those are the ones who've already been exposed and kept walking. They carry their scars like trophies, reminders of battles fought against illusion. They've been burned, branded, exiled, but never broken. Because the unholy don't live by approval. They live by authenticity. And authenticity is the only holiness that can't be faked. So when they call you unholy, maybe they're just telling the truth without realizing it. Maybe what they really mean is that you stopped pretending, that you've become everything they secretly wish they had the courage to be. Because in a world built on masks, the ones who dare to show their real faces will always look unholy to the blind. You did something unholy, huh? That's what they say when you stop fitting into their little moral mold. When you stop dancing to their tune. They call it unholy because it doesn't serve them. Because it makes them uncomfortable. Because your actions reminded them of how fragile their beliefs are. They spend their whole lives pretending to be pure, pretending to be righteous, And then someone like you comes along and shatters that illusion with one act of honesty. One moment of raw, unfiltered humanity. That's all it takes. One glimpse of truth, and suddenly you're the sinner. You see, the word unholy doesn't mean evil. It means inconvenient. Inconvenient to their lives, to their comfort, to their control. It's what they label you when you step outside the lines they drew to keep you predictable. They don't care what's right or wrong. They care about what keeps the order. And when you disrupt it, they panic. Because deep down, they know the order is fake. It's just fear dressed up as morality. They want you tame, repentant, sorry. They want you to kneel, whisper apologies for daring to exist beyond their permission. That's how they keep their illusion alive. But what if that unholy act wasn't evil at all? What if it was the first real thing you've ever done? Maybe it was messy, reckless, painful, but it was yours. Maybe, for the first time, you didn't follow a rule. You followed instinct. You followed truth. And truth doesn't always look holy. It looks raw. It looks dangerous. It looks alive. The world doesn't hate sin. It hates freedom. Because freedom means you stop asking for permission. It means you stop living for their approval and start living for your own sanity. They'll make you feel dirty for doing what they secretly wish they could. That's the game. They project their hunger onto you, their envy, their shame. They call you unholy to hide their own desires. Because everyone's got a shadow, but most people lock it away and pretend it doesn't exist. You opened the door. You let the shadow breathe. You did what they all think about, but never act on. And that makes you dangerous. Not because you're wrong, but because you're proof that the rules can be broken. They'll try to bury you under guilt. They'll whisper, "How could you?" As if they wouldn't. They'll act horrified, but their eyes will linger just a second too long. Because deep down, they recognize it. They see a piece of themselves in your so-called sin. That's why they have to condemn you, to protect the illusion that they're different. But they're not. They just haven't been caught being honest yet. The beauty of doing something unholy is that it strips away pretense. It forces you to face who you are without the noise of what the world expects. There's no mask left to hide behind, no sermon to excuse yourself with. It's just you, raw and exposed. And in that nakedness, there's a strange kind of truth. You see what you're made of. You see what matters and what was never real. You see that unholy is just another word for awake. The ones who never get their hands dirty, they're the ones who live half alive. Too scared to fall, too scared to feel. They trade passion for safety, truth for reputation. But the ones who've done something unholy, they've crossed a line they can never uncross. And in that crossing, they see the world for what it is. They learn that morality isn't black and white. It's painted by whoever's holding the brush. They realize that sometimes you have to step into the dark to understand what light really is. They'll tell you to repent, to cleanse yourself, to erase the evidence of your imperfection. But maybe imperfection is the point. Maybe being unholy just means you stopped lying about being perfect. The cracks in your story aren't mistakes. They're proof you lived. They're proof you felt. They're proof you made choices that belong to you, not to the world. Everyone wants purity until they realize purity is emptiness. There's no growth there, no depth, no soul. The unholy ones, they've lived. They've tasted truth, and truth is never sterile. You did something unholy because you acted on what they suppress. You followed the whisper they pretend not to hear. You chose reality over image. And yes, it scared them. Because nothing terrifies people more than someone who can't be shamed. They can take everything from you. But if you stop apologizing, if you wear your sin like armor, they lose their power. That's what holiness was never meant to be: control. They made it a weapon, and you refused to kneel. You didn't destroy goodness by doing something unholy. You destroyed the illusion that goodness needs to look perfect. You reminded the world that even in the dirt, there's beauty. Even in the chaos, there's truth. That maybe sin and salvation aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. You fall, you rise, you fall again. That's not corruption. That's life. That's the pulse of being human. So maybe, when they call you unholy, you should smile. Because what they're really saying is that you've lived without their leash. That you've seen something real. That you've touched the part of yourself they're too afraid to meet. You did something unholy. And for the first time, it was real. Everyone's got a line they swear they'd never cross until life drags them to it. Then, suddenly, that line starts to blur. You tell yourself you're different, that you're in control, that you know where the edge is. But when the moment comes, when your back's against the wall and the world's pressing down on your throat, you realize the edge isn't a line, it's a mirror. And in that reflection, you see something you've been avoiding your whole life, what you're truly capable of. That's when you do something unholy. Not because you wanted to, but because pretending to be innocent doesn't survive reality for long. People love to talk about choices, as if they're clean, simple, righteous. But choices aren't made in sunlight. They're born in shadows. No one chooses the dark until the light turns its back on them. And when it does, when everything you counted on vanishes, you stop caring about what's right. You start caring about what works. That's the truth most people choke on. They judge from a distance, with clean hands and calm hearts. But when they're the ones in the fire, they'll reach for anything to survive. They'll cross lines, break vows, make deals with devils they swore didn't exist. And afterward, they'll pretend it wasn't them. They'll call it weakness or madness or a moment of sin. But it wasn't. It was honesty. The kind that doesn't need forgiveness. They tell you doing something unholy means you've lost yourself. But maybe it means you finally found yourself. The self that doesn't exist just to please, obey, or fit in. The one that's been waiting for you under all the polite lies and quiet fears. Because deep down, everyone's got a version of themselves they've buried. The one that doesn't care about approval. the one that's tired of pretending. And sometimes